So good morning, everyone, and welcome to another Kapihan sa SWS. Hello to everyone here at the SWS Knowledge Center and over at Zoom. Um, Hello to our fellows here at the SWS Knowledge Center. So today we have a very important topic to discuss. Our speaker is Professor Marco Garrido. He is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Chicago. He is the author of The Patchwork City and is currently working on a new book on corruption, politics, and the politics of knowledge in the Philippines called, called Bad Words. He is also editing a volume on historical and ethnographic approaches to Philippine politics. This is his second time here at the Kapihan. He gave a talk also more than 3 years ago. So please welcome again here, Professor Marco Garrido.
Magandang umaga sa inyong lahat. Maraming salamat sa pagkakataon mag-present dito sa Kapihan. In fact, I'm going to switch to English. The last time I presented, in fact, was a presentation of preliminary research, just to give you a sense of how long it takes for research to get done. Only now, 3 years later, am I beginning to chip away at that mountain of research that I collected for 2022, 2023. So I couldn't think of a better place to present it than the SWS, the Kapihan, where the last time I presented it, it was hinog pa, as they say. Okay, so I'm going to go straight to it. I'm going to move quickly through the first part so I can get straight to the data. And just a warning, I'm going to switch. For the most part, I'll present in English, but the data I'll present in Filipino. I hope that's okay. Okay, so the drug war, which I'll refer to as Tokhang, mainly targeted the urban poor, and yet they strongly support it. Why? That's the puzzle. The scholarship, for the most part, has focused on the drug war itself, the role of Rodrigo Duterte in inciting the killings themselves, the killers, the victims, and the effort to bring the killers to justice. The result is a picture of the drug war as indiscriminate, ruthless, and bloody, a crime against humanity and against the poor in particular. There is truth to this, but understanding Tokhang only in terms of this picture deepens the puzzle. It makes it hard to understand why the poor, the very targets of Tokhang, would support it. The focus of the study then is on representing as faithfully as possible the perspective of poor communities most affected by Tokhang. My aim is not just to solve the puzzle, but to see more clearly the experiences of this group, and in so doing, raise new, but I think necessary questions about what Tokhang means for different sectors of society. My aim is to develop a more complete, albeit more complicated and contentious picture of reality. Okay, so I'm very quickly, I'm going to establish Tokhang. I assume most of you are familiar with it, but it's really important we understand the exact parameters of what we're talking about. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so really, we're talking about Oplan Double Barrel, which had two components: Operation HVT, High Value Target, and Operation Tokhang. One was the ground, one was above. But for the most part, people on the ground, including us here in civil society, refer to the whole drug war as Tokhang. And so for the most part, I'll refer to it as Tokhang. Tokhang mainly targeted poor communities in the NCR, so that's Metro Manila. And they were the main target, as I'll show, of the first most bloody phase of Tokhang. Now, the public narrative tends to focus on the EJ case. No? They focus on the perpetrators of the killings, the police, as well as masked men, vigilantes, these people, the summary killings, the planting of evidence, claims of nanlaban, the financial incentives, impunity, the barangay being pressured to cooperate with police, the construction of watch lists, and so on and so forth. You know, oops. Okay. Now, the so-called accomplishment in the first 6 months is really breathtaking. There were 40,000 operations, 48,000 arrests, 2,300 killings, 40% of which in NCR alone. First 6 months lang ha. And there were over 1 million surrenderies. Now, surrenderies is a word for people who submit to rehabilitation. So their names on the watch list, they're presented with this, and they submit to a rehab program for about 6 months in order to get some kind of clemency. So over 1 million surrenderies. Now, Tokhang, as you know, was quite controversial, both internationally and domestically. Domestically, I'm sure you're aware of a number of scandals. In October 2016, a South Korean businessman was killed. His name was Ji Ik-ju. There was one scandal followed by another in August 2017, the killing of Kian de los Santos in Caloocan, another scandal. Later on, 2019, the so-called ninja cops, these cops who recycle the shabu they confiscate. And as a result, Tokhang was suspended and relaunched a number of times, right? And this will be clear in a moment. Now, the death toll is subject to some debate. The most conservative figure is the PNP. They claim about 6,000 deaths. ACLED, I think, is probably the most reliable source for this data. ACLED stands for Armed Conflict Location and Event Data. They're a global monitor, and they think the number is closer to 8,000. Now, if you look at human rights groups, on the other hand, as well as the ICC, the number is much higher. We're talking 12 to 30,000, right? So it's a widespread. The point is Tokhang was bloody, whether it's 8,000 or 12,000. And of course, as you know, Duterte is currently on trial at the ICC for crimes against humanity. Now, let me give you a sense of, again, of the phenomenon of Tokhang. So this is not my illustration. This comes from ACLED. And this is fatalities in the war on drugs. And as you can see, most of it happened very, very quickly. Again, if you remember, the drug war happened almost immediately as Duterte took office. And the killings happened immediately. Within the first 6 months alone, 2,300 people were killed, 40% in Metro Manila. So that's represented by here, as you can see, fatalities. Now, let me walk you through this. As you can see, Tokhang happened in waves. Here's one wave, a second wave, a third wave. It was suspended and relaunched and had to do with the scandals, which forced them to recalibrate. Now, let me tell you, the black color is crimes, EJKs committed by vigilantes, masked men, whereas the orange is committed by police. The point here is that over time, at the beginning, about half the killings were perpetrated by vigilantes, half by police. Over time, mostly by police. This is drug war violence by province. As you can see, Metro Manila was the hardest hit in the first phase of the war, the first 6 months of the first year. And then the geographic focus of the drug war changed. It shifted from Metro Manila to Bulacan in the north, and then later to Nueva Ecija over time, right? So it changed. Now in Metro Manila itself, the hardest hit areas were the cities of Manila with 463 killings just in the first few months. Quezon City with 400 plus, and Caloocan. And to some extent also here Pasig. But for the most part, Manila, Quezon City, and Caloocan. And in Manila itself, the three districts hardest hit were Tondo, with the highest number of killings, Sampaloc, and Santa Ana. Okay, again, just want to establish the scope of Tokhang. Now I want to establish the level of support for Tokhang. And here I'm going to use SWS data focused on the NCR, so Metro Manila particularly. And I'm going to focus on the first year and a half of the Duterte administration. So from July 2016 to December 2017. So why just the first year and a half? Well, this is Tokhang's most bloody phase, and this is when it was identified with the Duterte administration. So when you think about the Duterte administration, you'd think Tokhang that first year. You know, this is before COVID, before these other events captured our attention. Moreover, the killings during this period were concentrated mainly in the NCR, and that's where I conducted qualitative research. And so I want to establish the level of support in Metro Manila particularly. That's why I'm focusing on these numbers. Okay, so let me show you these numbers. Okay, so I'm going to walk through this very, very quickly. So this is satisfaction with the drug war. PH is Philippines, NCR is Metro Manila, NCR ABC is support for the drug war, satisfaction for the drug war among the middle and upper class in NCR, in Metro Manila. NCR-D is lower class, NCR-E is poor. Now, I know there are a lot of numbers, but I want you to focus on the bolded ones. So particularly the median for this period, September 2016 to December 2017. So let me summarize the findings of this particular table. So first, there's high satisfaction across the board. No, that's very clear. If you look at the median numbers down here. Second, satisfaction in NCR is higher than in the country as a whole. Slightly higher, but higher nonetheless. Interesting, right? And keep in mind that ground zero for Tokhang at this moment is NCR. Third, NCR DE satisfaction, so lower class satisfaction, is higher for the most part than NCR ABC. As you can see here, 85, 79 versus 73. Higher yung NCR-DE satisfaction. And also interesting, it's also less volatile or less sensitive to controversy. So here's what I mean by this. If you look at range denotes the distance between the percentages during this period. So if you look at NCR-ABC satisfaction with the drug war, you see this dip between September 2016 and December 2016, a 25-point dip. That really, that really has to do, I think, with the GICU controversy, the killing of the South Koreans. It affected satisfaction among NCR ABC, but you don't see the same effect among DNE. Here again, September 2017 to December 2017, satisfaction dips among ABC from 100 to 67, right? So that's a 33-point dip, quite significant. And we might infer that this dip really has to do with the Kian de los Santos scandal, right? So point is, middle class, they're reacting to these controversies and it affects their satisfaction. But the DE, there's barely a change. In fact, it increases. So the point here is that they're less sensitive to these scandals. They don't care as much about it. Satisfaction remains high, even as Tokhang is mainly affecting their neighborhoods. Okay, so let's move on. Now, I want to just point out the relation between satisfaction with Tokhang, the drug war, and satisfaction with the president, with Duterte at the time. So I've switched tables. This is satisfaction with Duterte now. Again, please focus on the bolded numbers to make things simpler. So first, I point out that satisfaction with Duterte is generally high, right? These are high numbers across the board in Metro Manila, in the Philippines, A, B, C, D, E. Second, more interestingly, NCR-DE satisfaction increased with Tokhang. So that might not be immediately apparent from these numbers, but let me talk you through it. So as you can see, NCR-DE numbers, satisfaction with Duterte are pretty high. But if you compare them with pre-election and exit poll numbers, so in other words, the numbers of people who approved who approved of Duterte's candidacy and also the exit poll numbers among the DE were quite low. The major supporters of Duterte at the very beginning, before he was even elected, and that helped elect him, were ABC. And beyond ABC, people with greater education. Not the case once Tokhang started. In fact, you go from pre-election data showing approval for Duterte's candidacy among D at 39, E 22, exit poll data D 40, E 35%, to much, much higher numbers once Tokhang gets underway. And these numbers, once again, are much, much less volatile. Support for Duterte, satisfaction with Duterte is much less volatile, less sensitive to scandal, less sensitive to controversy among the lower class than it is among the middle and upper classes. The point I want you to take away here is that these data suggest that NCR-DE satisfaction for Duterte, at least in the first year and a half, is driven by support. Let me put that in another way. So the very communities in which Tokhang is happening are the very communities that are supporting Duterte, and whose support is the strongest and the most solid, the least volatile. Okay, is that clear? Okay. Now, I want to move on and talk about how support for Tokhang is far more complex than it seems. And it's very, very important that we understand its complexity. Otherwise, we misunderstand the situation. So here's what I mean. Support for Tokhang, I'm going to suggest, really comprise, there are two streams that go into it, and they both need to be held together. One, there's what we call the nabawasan narrative, right? There's support because of a marked decrease in the drug problem in people's neighborhoods. This is very well borne out by SWS data. 88% believe nabawasan ang drug problem sa neighborhoods, sa barangay namin. Right? It's not just drugs. Crime was also down across the board. Robberies, burglaries, physical violence. This is significant drops, objectively recorded. But it's not just that. It's not just the Nabawasa narrative that's significant. Alongside this Nabawasa narrative, we might also identify an Nadamay narrative. People across the board believe EJKs are a serious problem. So according to the SWS, 69% believe it's a problem, 22% undecided. Almost everyone believes it's important to keep suspects alive, 95%. What I'm trying to say is nobody wants to see people killed, including in these neighborhoods, these poor neighborhoods. They don't want to see people killed. Of course not. These are the people's neighbors, their family members. They want suspects alive, right? They also worry that they themselves will be affected by the killings, nadamay, so 78%, right? So again, I bring these figures to your attention in order to deepen the puzzle at stake. Why such high and stable support for Tokhang among the people most affected by it? Moreover, how do people on the ground articulate the positive and negative views of Tokhang? In other words, the nadamay and nabawasan narrative. How do we make sense of this? No, that's the puzzle. Okay, now let me walk you through some explanations and then present my own findings. Okay. Okay, so some people suggest that this support is not real. And what this means is they think that there's a social desirability bias. People are afraid, and therefore they're not attesting to their true views. They're too scared. The problem with this approach is it's contradicted quite roundly by the evidence. Quantitative evidence, for instance, I came to my attention that Sol Iglesias has a paper that contests the Kasuya and Miwa paper, suggesting social desirability bias. But moreover, the qualitative evidence, people who actually do work on the ground, find the support to be very genuine, very real. So that really suggests that this support is real. It's not fake. It's not people scared. Okay. Another paper suggests that support is instrumental, and this is produced by our own Steve Rood and others. You know, the idea is that Duterte delivered the goods. Now, I like this paper very much, and I think this argument is broadly correct, but I think it's also limited by its use of survey data. If in fact Duterte delivered the goods, further questions remain. Why did these goods, nabawasan, outweigh the bads, nadamay? That requires different methods to get that, to unpack. No? So it may be true. I do think it's true, in fact, that people are reacting to nabawasan, the decrease in the drug problem. But why did it overrule the killings that were happening in their neighborhood? That's what we need to find out also. Now, another popular explanation is the penal populism or the securitization explanation. The idea here is that Duterte securitized drug problem. He made it an issue. He elevated it. The question for me, though, is why did people respond? You know, okay, so he elevated the drug problem. He made law and order an issue. But what did it mean for people? Why did it resonate with people? Why did they respond? So Curato and others suggest that there's a kind of anxiety in the community that sweeps through. And because of that anxiety, they're responding. But I want to know more about this anxiety. I think we could develop that bit further. Wataru Kusaka and others suggest that what's at stake are moral differentiation or moral distinctions. No, my issue with this particular explanation is it's a bit general. We make moral distinctions all the time, diba? We regularly distinguish between good and bad. The question in this case is why would somebody be so bad that they would be subject to rehabilitation or even elimination? What accounts for the moral force, in other words, behind these distinctions? That's what I want to know. So hindi lang may good, may bad. What makes someone so bad that you would subject them to killing? Okay. We need a better understanding of the communities at stake. What's happening on the ground, specifically their social structure. Now, I'm a sociologist, and social structure is a key word for me. And by social structure, I mean common patterns of social interaction. So how people relate to each other and the common sense rules associated with them, the forms and norms of community, as it were. In other words, my relation to other people in the community and what that means for me, what the rules are to our relationship. Okay. Now, the focus of the approach I'm advocating, is on reconstructing the social worlds people inhabit and in which support for Tokhang not only makes sense, but acquires moral force. So I'm really going to focus on how people, not just people's views, but where those views come from, what their lives look like. To me, I think that's essential to understanding why their views not only are what they are, but why they have such power, such urgency. Okay. So there are scholars who take a community-focused approach, such as the one I'm advocating, and I want to make sure I give them credit. Jensen and Apal have a book on communal intimacy in Caloocan. The idea behind communal intimacy is that local knowledge was mobilized in support of the drug war. So in the construction of watch lists, for instance, in the surveillance of people within the barangay itself. Rowena Briones has a marvelous dissertation examining the institution of voluntary surrender. And she argues that within the community, voluntary surrender was portrayed as a show of mercy. The community, in other words, had its own understanding for what surrendering for what surrendering meant, and for how Tokhang played out within their community. So both of this scholarship highlight the role of the barangay in the prosecution of Tokhang, and I'm going to do the same. I'm going to build on this line of investigation, and I'm going to frame support for Tokhang in terms of the demand and supply of social order within these communities. Now, I'm going to be very, very concrete, but before that, I want to give you a sense of my argument. So this might be a bit abstract, but it's in preparation to really talk about what's happening on the ground. Okay, 1 second. All right. So let me give you a preview of my findings, and then I'm going to launch on the ground. No. So first, I found qualified support for Tokhang. Now, very important, qualified, hindi lubos, qualified. Evidence for both the Nabawasa narrative, but also the Nadamay narrative. I'm going to argue reflects a collective demand for order rooted in the social structure of the community. Now, to be precise, by social structure, I mean that we have to take into account poverty as a characteristic of these communities and what that means for how people live and how they think. And second, density. Now, with density, I'm going to talk about two. One is physical density, and that's just how close we are to people physically, no? And the place I studied, Tondo, is extremely dense, but hindi lang physical density. Also interested in what Durkheim called moral density. Now, by moral density, Durkheim meant the intensity of social interaction. The intensity of social interaction, he argued, made people feel a sense of groupness. Think about a family, for instance. Mataas yung moral density sa loob ng isang pamilya. Ibig sabihin, you feel a sense of identification, of connection with other people in that family. Now, you think of yourself as a group. Your identity is bound up with the other people within that group. So that's what I mean by moral density. It's going to be an important term because I'm going to argue that moral density creates a strong sense of community and mutual obligation. Now, the moral density of the communities I study facilitated aid, but it also amplified harm, as I will show. Disorderly actions, or gulo, ripple outwards, affecting not just households, but also relatives, also neighbors, the whole community at large. Okay. Insofar as these actions are seen as threatening the community at large, they invite reaction in the form of social control. Now, I imagine social control might have a negative connotation for most of us. We associate it with repression, for instance, or censorship. But I'm invoking a more classical meaning to social control. These are efforts to regulate individual actions in the interest of maintaining order. In other words, social control is often public-minded. You exercise social control in order to maintain the security or the peace within a community, for instance, in the name of the community itself, as I'll demonstrate. And so while social control is exercised at all levels of the community, the barangay is its main organ. The barangays I studied in Tondo participated in Tokhang willingly, I will argue, because they saw it as enabling ongoing communal efforts at social control. Moreover, they participated in their view on behalf of the community at large. In fact, articulated in terms of public spiritedness. So the concept of moral density really helps us understand, I think, the demand for social order driving local participation in Tokhang. The concept of social control, on the other hand, speaks to the supply of social order. People generally supported Tokhang because they saw it as increasing the supply of social order. And for most people, not everyone, but for most people, the community process associated with Tokhang represented a kind of justice. But let me demonstrate this. So I'm simply presenting the argument in abstract at this point so you can follow as I talk about the data. But before I get to the data, let me just discuss my methods. Very important for an academic to talk about his methodology. So first, let me say that this is part of a larger research project. In fact, I didn't even intend to study Tokhang. I was interested in people's experience of democracy. And the last time I presented at KAPIHAN, that's what I talked about because I was in the country to 2022, 2023. I conducted research over a period of 1 year, 12 months. And I talked to people about their experiences of democracy. But Tokhang kept coming up again and again and again, as did Duterte. I didn't ask about it. It came up. Moreover, I found people were supportive. They talked about these things favorably, even as at the same time they talked about people na tokhang sa kanilang neighborhoods. And this for me made the puzzle very vivid. And so that's why I decided to do a separate project as part of the larger research project focused specifically on these neighborhoods. So to pick cases, I picked Tondo, of course, because in some ways that's where the killings happened in that first 6 months, right? Tondo, Sampaloc, Santa Ana, Manila City. So I went straight to Tondo to a set of barangays to try to find out, and I got access through a couple of contacts. One was a businessman who had grown up in Tondo, who helped provide me with a contact. Another was a graduate student who gave me access to a different who had also grown up in Tondo, and he gave me access to a different part of Tondo. One was closer to the pier, one was more inside. No. So in terms of what I did, I started with the barangay, syempre. I talked to the kagawa, the chair, the tanods, and so on, and then I solicited interviews myself. Now, in total, I did about 53 interviews. And to be clear, I know this is SWS, but I'm an ethnographer. And so I don't come with a battery of questions. No, I don't ask, oh, how was Tokhang with you? What do you think? I don't do that. As an ethnographer, I ask about people's lives. I ask what their lives are like. I ask about their neighborhoods. And I wait for the Tokhang to come up. And it always came up. But I don't ask about it. I put it in the context of what is your life like? Where were you born? How long have you lived here? What's the neighborhood like? And I let them talk over the course of 2 or 3 hours. Because this context is essential for understanding where these views come from, as you'll see. I also want to say that I'm going to present, I think, some findings that you might find controversial. I want to assure you that I've been studying the urban poor in Metro Manila for siguro mga 20 to 25 years now. Ever since my dissertation field work in the mid-2000s. And so even though I'm going to focus only on Tondo, in fact, I've done research across the whole of Metro Manila, not just in informal settlements and urban poor areas, but middle-class subdivisions. And if you're familiar with my first book, The Patchwork City, that's what I talk about. And so I've visited dozens upon dozens of barangays. And at siguro at this point, formal interviews pa lang, it's about 500 people or more, right? So this is the findings I present today grow out of that knowledge, okay? So I visited 6 barangays. I'm going to call them A to F, but of course in the city of Manila, it's numbers, no? I'm going to call them A to F. 3 with Tokhang-related killings happened sa loob ng barangay and 3 without. Now, again, you probably know this, but the barangays in Manila are relatively small and extremely, extremely dense. Siguro between 1 to 3,000 people. Moreover, it's not just the physical density, but the moral density that matters. That 1 to 3,000 people, they all know each other more or less, or they're connected by at most 1 degree of separation. So think of it as a big high school. You know, even if you don't know everybody, if something happens to somebody there, you've heard of them. And parang may connection sa'yo. That's what I mean by moral density. And that's important to understand when I start talking about these communities. Okay. Okay. So again, just to do my due diligence, 53 informants, 3% residing in a barangay with Tokhang-related killings, the other half hindi. 36% male, 64% female. The median age was about 57. Most of them had a high school degree or less, and that's typical for these kinds of neighborhoods, very few with college degrees. In terms of work, again, typical of these neighborhoods, the chief occupations were vendor, trader, buy and sell, driver ng sidecar, so this is tricycle, dock worker, domestic worker, construction worker, police officer, retail worker, gig worker, and some overseas contract workers, mainly seamen and others. Okay, again, typical for urban poor neighborhoods. No? Okay, all right. We're going to switch to findings. So give me a second. Okay. First, qualified support for Tokhang. Now, support, you have to understand before we even begin that support is complex and not uncritical, right? I'll explain what I mean. So let me talk about some of the incidents of Tokhang in Barangay D, for instance. Just one barangay. There were 3 incidents of Tokhang who lived there. In one case, an informant's uncle was washing clothes. When the police found him, they kicked him in the stomach and they dragged him off to one side and shot him several times in the chest. His 9-year-old grandchild found his body and was inconsolable, crying and crying. In another case, police forcibly entered a man's house. The whole family was upstairs. They called this man down. He told the family to remain upstairs, and as he made his way down, they shot him several. In the third case, the masked men killed 3 people. 2 were reputed drug users, but the third was an innocent 15-year-old boy. He was shot trying to flee the vigilantes. The wife of one of the men was at the foot of the stairs when it happened. She witnessed. As soon as she heard the shots, she went back and locked in her room. The incident was partly captured by CCTV and in fact posted on Facebook. An American reporter visited the woman asking questions. The police came by, confiscated the CCTV footage, and warned the woman about talking to the media. Okay. Informants in general described the police handling the dead bodies parang baboy lang, like pigs. They pulled them down the street, threw them onto the flatbed of a sidecar, and sent them to the hospital. Kunyari lang. Because it was clear that they were dead. Kunyari lang, as if something could be done. And to be clear, these incidents had a traumatizing effect. So people say, so if you pardon me, I'll switch to Filipino. Sunod-sunod ang putok, di malaman kung saan galing. Di ka pwedeng sumilip, baka matamaan ng ligaw na bala. Magsisiksikan lang kami sa sulok o kung nasa labas ka, takbuhan sa kabilang bahay. Parang hindi mo alam kung maihi ka dahil sa takot. So to be clear, it was a scary time. No? Scary, scary, scary. At the same time, people supported it. Nonetheless, despite so I want you to understand the complexity of support. No, that's why I'm going through this detail. People not only supported it, but they wanted it back. They wanted the return of Tokhang. And to make the puzzle particularly vivid for you, I'm going to give you a story. Just Cap Alex. This is the captain of one of the barangays, the chair. So sabi ni Cap Alex, matindi si Duterte, pero nabawasan talaga ang problema sa droga. Ngayon wala na si Duterte, ito na naman. Bumabalik ang mga adik. Si Bongbong hindi katulad ni Duterte, maluwag sa drugs. And then I said, parang namimiss niyo si Duterte. Yung kamay na bakal ba? And siya, ay oo, gusto ko nga siya. And then Alex pointed to a vacant house overtaken by addicts. And he said he had cleared them out. It was a new son. He said during Tokhang, they wouldn't have dared occupy them. And then he was quiet for a moment. Sasabihin ko sa iyo ha, anak ko, 38 years old, nagtutulak ng shabu. Sabi ko sa kanya, "Nak, tigilan mo na yung trabaho mo, delikado na." Ang sagot niya sa akin, "Hayaan mo na tay. Pag nahuli, di pinatay ako. Paglibing ninyo." So, year 2021, may tumawag sa akin, "Chairman, oo kako. Mare, bakit? Yung anak mo, na Tokhang." So, bihis ako, pinuntahan namin mag-asawa, tatlo sila nakahiga sa morgue. Anak ko, apat ang tama rito sa dibdib. Niyakap ko na lang. Sabi ko, "Nak, ikaw hindi ka nakinig sa akin. Pero tutuparin ko yung sinabi mo. Palilibing kita maayos." Panganay ko yun, kaisa-isang lalaki. Pinag-aralan ko yun. I said, "Ang hirap po. Ang hirap tanggapin." And he said, "Oo. Pero ako nakahanda sa kalooban ko dun. At tinanggap ko naman yun." And then he went on and talked about other things. But I didn't move on because I was puzzled. I couldn't understand. His own son had been killed. And he had just told me that he supported Duterte. How was this possible? So at some point, I paused the conversation. We were talking about something else. And I asked him, "How can you still support Duterte? Your own son was killed." And then he said, "Ay, hindi. Hindi ko na pwedeng sisihin si Duterte. Alam ko naman mali yung ginawa ng ko. Hindi ko siya sinisi. Mali talaga eh." Now, that to me really embodied the puzzle. That made it clear what the puzzle was, what I had to try to explain. For this man, there was no puzzle. There was no puzzle. And I wanted to see it the way he saw it. I wanted to try to understand that. Okay, so I'm going to try to offer an explanation that will help us try to see what Cap Alex saw, or why he held this view, how he held these two things together. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to focus on the social structure of the community. So first, poverty. A little preview first before we get to the data. No? When I say poverty, what's really important to keep in mind is the vulnerability these people feel. There's no room for error. There's no space. In other words, one mistake, one missed payment, one income, there are consequences. That's what poverty means. And so it's extremely important you stay on track. There's no room for error, in other words. People live on a knife's edge. And so the common refrain, particularly among the mothers, about their children is, "Sana lang makatapos ang pag-aaral." Right? I would hear it again and again and again, not just in the context of Tokhang, but in the context of urban poor communities. In other words, in order for us to get out of poverty, we need good jobs. In order to have good jobs, we need education. But even to keep people in school, even just to finish high school, is an achievement. So sana lang makatapos. That's the beginning of our way out. And so what I found is that people who live in these communities engage in a very meticulous accounting. By this, as I'll demonstrate, what I mean is they know exactly, for instance, price pa lang, in the weeks that I was doing research here, they could tell me the same ways, those investment bankers or traders watch the stock market. They could tell me the price of rice to the peso. Oh, it's 34 pesos, pero may inflation. So ngayon 30, ngayon 36. They knew the price of rice exactly. But it's not just the price of also their budget, also their time, everything meticulously accounted for, as I'll demonstrate. And so given this meticulous accounting, given the need to stay on track, gulo is fundamentally derailing. It threatens their discarte, so to speak. Okay, so let me illustrate, no? Let me illustrate. So I want to talk about Artemio. Artemio is a 56-year-old pedicab driver. He works from 6 in the morning to 5 in the evening, and he makes about 300 to 400 pesos, minus pa yung boundary dun, right? Sabi niya, eksakto yung income niya for daily expenses. So that's rice, ulam, pasok, baon. Sabi, by the way, I interviewed Artemio during a holiday, a public holiday. No? So sabi niya, "Buti nga ngayon walang pasok. Baon ng anak ko, araw-araw 150. So nakatipid ako ng 150. Pag may magandang kita, nagsasabaw kami ng baboy. Kahit 1/4, ganun. Sinasabawan ko. Karamihan talaga ulam isda. Minsan manok. Isasabaw lang. Yung galunggong, 140 kalahati. Sa 100, siguro mga 5 piraso lang. E di, magbaboy ka na lang sa bawan mo. 1/4, oo. And then I said, araw-araw po kayo nagtrabaho. And he looked at me like I was an idiot because it was an idiot. Sabi niya, pag hindi tayo naghahanap buhay, walang makakain ng pamilya. Pambayad pa ng ilaw, tubig. Walang tigil. Anak ko, this is Artemio, anak ko grade 11, gusto niya magiging police. Bahay-pasok lang. Uwi niya galing ng eskwela, bahay lang siya, gagawin ng assignment. Tapos kakain, matutulog, bukas pasok na naman. Sabi ko sa kanya, yung pangarap mo magiging police, tuparin mo yan. Para sa iyo, hindi para sa akin. Sabi niya, pa, tutuparin ko ito pa. Pinag-aaral mo ako eh. Hindi ko ikinahihiya yung sidecar boy ka. Sabi ko sa mga kaklase ko, hindi kita ikinahihiya. I said, walang dahilan para mahiya. Sabi niya, oo, syempre, mahiya ka kung magnakaw ka. Ito marangal na trabaho. So there's a lot there. So what I wanted to demonstrate just in that bit is first, meticulous accounting. How much can you buy? 1/4, 1/2, isda, manok, baboy, the price of things. How much time people have. Is it a holiday? Is it not? Do I have to pay for baon or not? Do I have to pay for pamisahe or not? But also the sense of obligation each to each other. The father to the son to the father. The task, sana lang makatapos in order to move ahead. We need to appreciate these bonds. No? That's why I'm taking the trouble to illustrate them. Okay. The other aspect of social structure I want to talk about is density. Once again, density is not just physical. Physical talaga, I mean, Tondo extremely, extremely dense, but also, as I said, moral. Moral, the intensity of social interaction. Moral density creates a sense of mutual obligation. And this means that no one goes hungry. It increases the availability of help. If you're hungry, someone in your household will kick in. Guaranteed. If not your household, your relatives. If not your relatives, the neighbors. If not the neighbors, the barangay. No one goes hungry. People look out for each other. They feel obliged to help. But it's a double-edged sword. No? This moral density, this sense of mutual obligation also increases people's susceptibility to harm. So let me illustrate this point. So syempre, spatial proximity matters. If you're in the vicinity of violence, baka madadamay ka. But it's social proximity that I want us to focus on. In other words, the social fabric in these places is stretched so tight that if you disturb it in one part, people feel it all across the fabric. So disorderly actions ripple outwards, affecting relatives, neighbors, and the community as a whole. So again, better if I illustrate what I mean. So I'm going to talk about Cap Dennis and then switch to Jovi. So sabi ni Cap Dennis, staying off drugs or keeping clean is like paying for a sidecar. I'm going to translate so I can move faster. You have to pay 150 a day until you pay off the 25,000. And then the sidecar is yours, the pedicab. No? If you fall off in your payments because you don't work, or even if something happens out of your control, the owner may decide to give the sidecar to someone else. But it will be your fault because the process is clear. It's not easy, he said. You have to work hard. You have to be disciplined. You have to stay on track. But that's life. And life is unforgiving. Sabi niya. That's his experience of it, right? And drugs ruins your discarte, sabi niya. It derails you from this track. You end up spending your days, this is Cap Dennis, you end up spending your days playing video carrera, and then when the money's gone, you start stealing, you end up in prison or worse, and your family suffers because of it. Drug destroys not just your life, but the lives of the people around you. So to illustrate, let me talk about Jovi. Jovi is 51 years old, a pedicab driver. Now, Jovi's wife of 12 years was arrested along with her friends for using shabu. Jovi didn't know she was using, and when he found out, he felt betrayed. So sabi ni Jovi, hindi ko na pinupuntahan sa city jail kasi baka pag lumabas, babalik pa rin at babalik. Hindi ko siya tinatanggap. And then I said, masama ang loob ninyo sa kanya? He said, opo, totoo po yan. kasi binaliwala niya ang mga anak namin. Ngayon ako lang ang bumubuhay sa kanila. Siya po ang humiwalay sa amin. Siya ang umiwan sa aming pamilya. Napamahal siya, sir, sa bisyo, pero kami pamilya parang binaliwala. So Jovi has to work harder. He has to make the little money he makes as a pedicab driver stretch further. He has 5 kids, 3 dropped out of school. He works from 7 in the morning to 6 in the evening. When he gets home, he just watches TV until he falls asleep, has to get up for work the next day. His eldest daughter and his mother stay at home with the youngest ones, and they run the household. But the point is that everyone has to work harder because the mother is in jail. Everyone suffers. And I asked Jovi, paano po yung mga anak niyo? Di po ba hinahanap nila yung, and he interrupted, mama nila? Parang balewala rin. Kapag tumawag yung asawa ko, ayaw nila sagutin sa galit ng mga anak ko sa ginawa niya sa amin. What I'm trying to illustrate here is not only that when gulo happens, in this case drugs, it affects the whole household, but it leads to a kind of reaction of binaliwala, betrayal, of anger, right? And this anger is felt, I'm going to suggest, not just against individuals, but it's felt by the community at large. Drugs, people feel, is an offense to the community. Sayang lang ang buhay mo. Right? Okay. All right. I'm going to switch to talk about social control. Just give me a moment. Oh, okay. Now I want to talk about social control. Can you hear me? No? Can you hear me? Okay, good. Now I want to talk about social control. Now, before we keep in mind that by social control, I mean simply efforts to maintain order undertaken in the name of the community at large. No? Efforts to maintain order on the community at large. There's a dynamic I found with respect to social control. People have to balance between pakikisama and disiplina. In other words, social control is not just about disciplina. It's not just about coercion. It has to be balanced by pakikisama. And it makes sense. People live, they have to get along with other people in that community, and that this dynamic is necessary. We might distinguish then between two social control. Now, exercise social control, whether hard and soft, depends on who the object of social control is. So when it comes to the self, yourself, the expectation is that you're disciplined. So it's hard. When it comes to the parents, they expect that you exercise social control on your children. And so when things happen, for instance, drugs and other kinds of gulo, the refrain is often, sana mga magulang nila, right? They're always asking, where are the kids? So the expectation is that parents keep their kids in control. Now, when it comes to neighbors, that's when it becomes a bit more of a balancing act, right? Because you can't simply be towards your neighbors. You have to ask some pakikisama. No? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay lang. Sige. Okay, I'll illustrate this in a moment. And when it comes to the barangay, social control has to soften even more, right? So let me give you an example by talking about Lola Neneng. Okay, so Lola Neneng is 64 years old. She grew up in Barangay, and she's a vegetable vendor. Now, over time, over her time vending vegetables, she's become a kind of community institution. No, she takes it upon herself as her job to keep the peace in the community. And so when women gossip, she scolds them. Sabi niya, nagchichismis hanggang sa mag-aabot sila magsasabunutan. Sabi ko, hindi maganda yan. Mag-usap lang kayo ng maayos. Nakikinig naman sila. When the kids who play by her vegetable stand, she says to them, hanggang 4 p.m. lang kayo ha, kasi may schedule tayo. The teenagers naman, they use the basketball court. They use the basketball court na hindi nakaschedule because the basketball court, of course, has a list of schedules. And so she claps 3 times to let the kids know that it's time to give way to the next. All of these are examples of social control. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with them. Maybe you know a Lola Neneng yourself. But in these communities, they're full of lola and nenings, no, who keep social control. That's the exercise of social control. With her grandkids, she pretends she doesn't hear them when they don't say po, po, po. Parang nga, sabi ko sa kanila, mahirap tayo, pero ayokong magiging bastos kayo. Kaya tinuturan ko kayo, dinidisiplina ko kayo ng maayos. Right? Now, that's not the only style of social control. This is a soft style of social control, as you can see. We might contrast it to a harder style, more kamay na bakal, you might say. There's another woman I learned in the community, and she carries around with her a pampalo, chinelas pa, and she threatens the kids with it. And in the neighborhood, the kid behind her back, the kids call her aswang or epal epal. Right? So the point I'm trying to make is communities are always in the process of social control, and different figures take it upon themselves to exercise the social control. It's quite normal. No, that's the point I want to make. Now, I want to focus, however, on the main institution of social control. So while social control is exercised by various community members, the barangay is the main organ of social control within the community. So what I want to do now is I want to talk about the role of the barangay within these communities. So the first major task of the barangay is welfare. So as I've said, at this point in my research career, I visited dozens of barangays, and I've come to acknowledge, when I talk to the barangay captain, he or she usually alludes to what I call two drawers. Now, drawers can be literal, they can be figurative, but one drawer has petty cash. The other drawer naman has medicines. Right? You can understand why he or she has these two drawers, because people approach the barangay, they need one or the other. And so he keeps them on hand. Now, not literal, sometimes the medicines are in a cabinet or petty cash in his wallet, but the point is I've come to associate these two drawers with the barangay. Now, as for the medicines, all kinds, no? Aspirin, antibiotics, medicine for diabetes, blood pressure, asthma, vitamins for children and seniors. Sometimes the barangay captains themselves sound like pharmacists. They talk about losartan, amlopidine, atorvastatin. It's pretty amazing. But hindi lang yung two drawers. The barangay, as you probably know, if you have a sense of these communities, engage in all kinds of outreach. So there are standing committees, as you know, health, committees for health, seniors, youth and sports, peace and order, environment and sanitation. There are special committees, the BDC for development, BDRRM for disaster relief, BAWC, the women's, BADAC, barangay anti-drug. Guys have to have this. Moreover, in addition to those committees, barangays engage in all kinds of activities all the time. What do? They administer vaccines. They distribute food and ayuda. They distribute school supplies to youth, birthday cakes to seniors. They hold feeding programs. They have vocational or livelihood workshops, how to make soap, electric plugs, monoblock chairs. They organize food drives, cleanup drives, basketball tournaments, pati beauty pageants, festivals, funeral processions. Some barangays award certificates and prizes to outstanding members of the barangay. Again, it's a community that that is self-conscious of itself as a community. We might describe the barangay as the brain of the community. Now, Durkheim described the state as the brain of society. By that, he meant it organizes and directs collective life. When I say the barangay is the brain of the community, I mean it compiles knowledge and deploys it in the interest of the community at large. Barangay knows who's working, who's not, who's unemployed. It knows what people do for work. It knows what their needs are. It knows who the neediest are, sino mga indigent. It knows who the seniors are. It knows what medicines the seniors need. It knows who's in school, who's out of school, who the youth are. It knows what school supplies they need. It knows how many babies there are in the neighborhood, which of those babies are underweight and in need of vitamins. And of course, it knows who's using drugs. So this is how you must understand the barangay. It compiles all this information in the interest of its tasks. One of its main tasks being welfare. No? The other main task of the barangay is security, right? And let me illustrate security by talking about two pairs of tanods. First, Romy and Romel, barangay E. So Romy and Romel, make ronda at night. So there's 6 tanods. They make ronda around the barangay at night. They go around twice, 10 p.m., midnight. They showed me the ruta nila. When they see someone outside, they tell them go inside. When they see children, the kids run away because they curfew nila at 10 p.m. The guys who are drinking, they tell them to wrap it up or keep it down. The people singing karaoke, they remind them that their neighbors are trying to sleep and have to get up early for work or for school. Again, social control. You know? They monitor crowds at events. There's a CCTV. They look at the CCTV. If there's kulo, they respond. They're armed with batons, instructed to exercise maximum tolerance, not to hurt people. But the truth is, they rarely need to exert force because they know everybody. They're connected to everybody and can talk to them and persuade them on the basis of that relationship. Now, if people don't comply, and that's rare, if people don't comply with the tanods, they go to the police. But again, that's rarely necessary. A lot of police live in the barangay themselves, and a lot of the kids grow up wanting to be police officers. Now, with Katya and Katrina naman, same barangay, you'll notice that there's a gender division of labor. Katrina go around during the day. They talk to people about their needs. They hear their complaints. They mediate disputes if necessary. Frequent cases of domestic disputes, sometimes abuse. The husband hits the wife forgives him. After a few months, it happens again. These cases involve VAWAC or the women's desk. Only in serious cases do they file a police report. Katya and Katrina run a feeding program for kids aged 2 to 12 years old. They weigh the babies, keep track of underweight or malnourished ones. They go to the palenque themselves for the feeding program. They buy school supplies for the kids. Such is their knowledge that they know that the notebooks they distribute used to have 58 leaf pages. Now it's only 30. Their knowledge is extensive, right? That's what I want to illustrate here. Now, okay. I want to underscore the fact that, as you saw with both cases, the barangay tries to deal with issues internally. So with mediation involving disputes between, say, couples or neighbors, at first the tanod tries to mediate. It's a spot mediation. If it's too hard to mediate, it's elevated, goes up to the chairman. If it's still more serious, it's elevated pa, goes to the lupon within the barangay justice system. Only in the gravest cases does it go outside the barangay to the police and the courts. So for the most part, they try to handle it inside. In fact, this distinction between inside and outside is quite significant. Barangay has a protective orientation. It tries to protect its members from the outside world. This will become significant in a moment, but I want to flag it now. For the most part, it tries to mediate, it tries to handle disputes internally, right? Moreover, the barangay officials demonstrate an ethic of public service. That's really the only way it can be described. Now, the chairman and kagawads are usually people of means, not always, but they certainly have to be respected. They have to be able to represent the community and have to be seen as part of it. They do a lot of work for little pay. The stipends of the chair is 41,000 pesos per quarter, so every 3 months. For the kagawads, 30,000. For tanods, 2,500 lang every 3 months. Higher officials are responsible for lower ones. So that means the chair distributes money to undertake tasks. The kagawads provide their tanods with pamisahe, supplies, ulam, kanin, aguinaldo for Christmas, and so on. Now, this comes from their small honorarium. You have to understand that the line between office and household is fuzzy. So when I ask where the money comes from, as you'll see, they often say, sarili kong bulsa. But what sarili kong bulsa means, money comes in, gets distributed. What's mine, what's yours, what's personal, what's official, these lines are fundamentally blurry because the need is great, right? These barangay officials have to bear the brunt of people's complaining. Moreover, the job carries risk from political rivals and people unhappy with their rulings. And so you often hear stories from chairmen of officials killed in disputes, or chairmen have had guns pointed at them because arising out of disputes. So the job is stressful, no? The job of these officials is stressful, and barangay officials describe themselves as, quote, shock absorbers. People do it out of an ethic of public service. So let me illustrate by giving you an example of somebody who embodies that ethic. Now I'm going to talk about Captes, Barangay A, during COVID. So one evening, Captes found out that the DSWD was distributing ayuda to local officials. This was about 6 p.m. siguro sa evening. She applied immediately, managed to secure 100,000 for the barangay that evening. We mobilized the Kagawads, some of whom had already turned in for the night. They knocked on the doors of the neediest. Kasi may listahan sila. They knocked on the doors of the neediest and distributed aid. She was careful not to give any of that money to her own relatives, not to the Kagawads, not to the Tanods, not to all of the people who, having found out that there was money, immediately rushed to the barangay in search of aid. She stuck to the list. She tried to be impartial. No. The next morning, she went back to the DSWD and pleaded for more aid. She knew that sometimes there was money left over. And so she was just trying to see if she could get more. And indeed, she did. She got 200,000 more, distributed that amount, and then went back again to return. She returned a third time to see if any more money was left, secured another 150,000. In all, she didn't sleep for 2 days straight, according to her. She just distributed ayuda. Now, Agnes is a functionary of the community. She's of the community, she belongs to it, but she also represents it. And it's a role that she comes to embody. She takes very, very seriously. And as a result, when it comes to who to give the aid, she feels like she has to act impartially. Kailangan fair. That as her own stature depends on it. Now, I want to be clear. This doesn't rule out self-interest. It doesn't rule out corruption. Some people might think there's corruption involved. And I think that's a difficult term because on the one hand, there's no doubt that this happens. And barangay officials themselves are aware of it. They talk about it and they're able to identify certain officials who have acted in ways that are unseemly. But what's often underappreciated is how powerful public-minded motives are. These officials want to represent their communities. It's important to their identity. Lofty or abstract about this, care about these communities because they belong to them in the same way they care about communities. This is what I mean by moral density. They feel like they have to represent these communities. To simply say, for an outsider to simply say there's corruption or this, I think is to misunderstand the dynamic that binds these people together, particularly officials to their constituents. Okay. Okay. Okay, I'm ready to talk about Tokhang now. But, give me a moment. Okay. So, everything else before this is important to understand. It's essential context for understanding Tokhang. That's why I went through the discussion of the barangay. But now let's talk about Tokhang itself. No? So, in Barangay F, when the subject of Tokhang came up in my conversation with Vincent, he picked up that I was using the word Tokhang to mean kill, Tinokhang, Tokhang niya. And he immediately corrected me. It doesn't mean kill, he said. It means to approach people and urge them to change. Sabi niya, na misinterpret nyo yung salitang Tokhang eh. Kasi paliwanag sa amin ng mga pulis yan. Salitang Tokhang, hindi ibig sabihin pag tinokhang ka, patayin ka. Yan ba yung approachable talk na pupuntahan ka sa bahay, kausapin muna. Oh, gusto mo ba magbago? Bibigyan ka naming pagkakataon magbago. Tapos, ipapasok ka namin sa mga intervention program, bibigyan livelihood. Ganun ang approach niyang Tokhang na yan. Sabi ni Cap Shirley, captain of Barangay C, that they approach users and pushers, ask them to quote unquote surrender. If not, their name goes on the watch list. We plead with them, she said. Think of your families. You have to be a role model. The ones that surrender are enrolled in a counseling program. They have to attend sessions twice a week. In fact, the Kagawad Raul, accompanies them. So I talked to Kagawad Raul. He's part of BADAC, the Barangay Anti-Drug Abuse Committee. Sabi ni Kagawad Raul, we spend our own time and money to help them. We enroll them in a rehab program. We accompany them to their sessions. We cover their pamisahe, pangmerienda, pati drug tests. Lahat sariling bulsa. In other words, again, it comes from our honorarium or our barangay budget. No, sariling bulsa. The word Cap Dennis used is sacrificio. We sacrifice for them. Why? It's my duty as chairman, sabi niya. And I said, why spend your own money? Because sabi niya, sariling bulsa. Why spend your own money? And he said the expenses are too small to budget or claim reimbursement for, so I just pay for it out of my pocket. Tapos sabi niya, my wife and I fight about it all the time. She says the money I make just goes back to the barangay. Give you a sense of what's happening. And it's not just the cost that people feel that they're shouldering, it's also the risk. Sabi ni Cap Shirley, chairmen have been killed by users upset that their names were put on the watch list. Sabi ni Kagawad Raul, we risk our lives because the people we put on the watch list, baka balikan, may seek revenge. Once an addict threatened him with harm, for instance, via text. And that's why they say they're careful about who goes on the watch list and who doesn't. Now, why do they do it, given the cost, given the risk? Again and again, these officials tell me that they're doing it for the community, a kind of public service ethic. Sabi ni Kagawad Raul, it's rewarding to see people turn over a new leaf, to get off drugs, to get better jobs. It makes us happy. By the same token, it's disappointing to see people relapse, fail their drug test, and go back to using. Cap Shirley tells me about one guy who's now clean and driving a sidecar, and proud na proud siya of this one guy. Happy to see fewer users and pushers on the street. She points out a drug den in the barangay, or used to be. There used to be a notorious drug den in the barangay. Sabi niya, the whole family was using, even the mother. And during Tokhang, a police asset identified the father. He was caught daw trying to buy drugs in a bus and executed. After that, family members scattered. Some went to Cavite, others to another barangay. Some ended up in prison. Now, for Captes, this development is a good thing because, in her view, that family was a scourge on the community. And without it, without that family, the community is safer. So that's her logic. That's how she's thinking here. She's thinking about the community. Sabi ni Cap Shirley, kung hindi pumasok si Duterte, siguro puno na ng droga ang barangay namin. Kaya, thank you Lord. Sabi ko nga ganon. So I want to emphasize that as the people I interviewed see it, in their eyes, Tokhang is not something imposed upon them. It helped them do something they want to do. It enabled the barangay to exercise greater social control. I want to be clear. They don't approve of the killing. Almost no one does. These are not bloodthirsty people. But they're willing to accept it as the price of a safer community. Captes, for instance, would prefer that users be arrested, not killed. But at the same time, she acknowledges that you can't force people to change. If they refuse to change, they have to be removed from the community somehow. Sabi ni Captes, she didn't vote for Duterte. In fact, she finds his conduct unbecoming. The way he swears, the way he carries himself in public, pangit daw. Hindi tama, hindi appropriate. And at the same time, she defends the drug war because from her point of view, it made her community safer. She appreciates the fact that by being hard, matigas, Duterte allows her to practice a softer approach as chairman. The drug war made people fearful and thus more likely to comply with the barangay's efforts at social control. Sabi niya, nabawasan dahil nagkaroon ng takot yung mga tao. Hindi pwedeng gawin namin yung ginawa niya. We ourselves couldn't do it that way. In other words, Captes is saying, I don't like Duterte, but by being hard, Duterte allowed us to be soft and to do something. Okay, so, all right. So let me try to wrap this up so we can get to the questions. Because I've been talking for a while and I appreciate your patience. Pero malapit na. Dalawang slides lang siguro. But, let me bring it home. So let me back up and talk about how the communities see it. So I'm going to distill the perspective of the community and the way it looks at Tokhang and the way it approaches yung mga drug and dealers. So how the community sees it, a distillation. So according to the community, they say to the drug user or the drug dealer, you chose to do drugs even if it harms the community. Nevertheless, we, the community, gave you the opportunity to change and did so at significant cost and risk to ourselves. Yet you chose to spurn or squander this opportunity. Hindi lahat, but those of you, some of you, chose to spurn or squander this opportunity. That's the way we see it. Having done all we can for you, we release you to the judgment of the outside world, the world of police, courts, and EJK. So this is the inside, outside. Inside may proseso, outside, bahala ka na. People see Tokhang as justice because, as they would often say to me, may proseso naman tayo. May proseso. By this, they mean that there's a process designed not just to rehabilitate individuals, but to reintegrate them into the community. And to be clear, this is a different process than the formal legal one. This is an internal process, a community process. Justice inheres in the observance of this internal community process. If you follow the process internally, justicia naman yun. Now, this process is protective, but fundamentally limited. Its effectiveness, in fact, depends on having a limit. The hard, impersonal world outside the barangay both justifies and enables the relative softness of the community approach. In other words, you need to understand these two things together. Duterte was hard so we can be soft, sabi ni Cap Shirley. Moreover, again, as many people see it, the process works. So in Barangay F, for instance, crime went down, people felt safer, youth stayed inside, meaning they were more likely to stay on track and be less likely to be derailed. For the vendors naman, the ones who work in Divisoria, they felt safer. Ngayon, magulo ulit. People are using drugs again out in the open, talamak. And the people in Barangay F yearn for Duterte's kamay na bakal because it underpinned a kind of peace for them. Okay, almost done. So you probably have gathered that the account I'm sharing with you today contradicts the public narrative in two ways. And before I go into precisely how it contradicts the narrative, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that public narrative is wrong. That's not what I'm saying. In fact, there's the interpretation on which the public narrative is based. It's found based on evidence naman eh. I'm saying it's partial. It's not the whole story. It's partial. We need to appreciate that the urban poor, for the most part, have a different interpretation of Tokhang. We need to consider this interpretation alongside the public narrative, and rather than choose one, appreciate the fact that each account gets at a different aspect of reality. Okay, so with that caveat, let me be specific about the ways this account contradicts the public narrative. So first, it contradicts a view of Tokhang as anti-poor. And again, that interpretation makes a lot of sense. But this account that I heard contradicts it. This account suggests Tokhang benefited the poor. So let me illustrate by talking about Renato. So sabi ni Renato, ang batas hindi pare-parehas. Para lang sa may pera. Buti nga si Duterte, walang pinipili. Pag sinabi patay ka, talagang patay ka. And he goes on to give an example of a mayor who was killed because of his involvement in the drug trade. So sabi niya, in English, Duterte doesn't choose. He enforced the rule. He enforced the law ruthlessly and equally. Now, maybe you might want to object to this and say, ay, hindi tama. The drug war overwhelmingly killed poor people. And to be sure, that's correct, no? That's correct. But if we insist on our own interpretation, then I think we're not really hearing what Renato is saying. What he and others like him are saying is that the drug war made their communities safer. And thus they see Duterte as having done something for them, the poor. And I think that needs to be taken seriously, no? Second, the account I've shared contradicts a view of Tokhang as unjust because it violated people's human rights. Again, I think that's a sound interpretation of Tokhang with evidence. But what I found on the ground is people believe Tokhang was just on the basis of this community process. So let me talk about Pasito. So when I ran into Pasito, he expressed genuine puzzlement when it came to the human rights framing of Tokhang. So he brought it up, no, not me. To him, human rights seemed to be a way of protecting the people doing harm to his community. Sabi niya, yung adik gumagawa ng masama, pag inaano mo tong adik, pinatahimik mo, may human rights ka. Nasaan ang fair justice nun? Tignan mo kunyari to, pumatay to, pinatay ko to. Ako pa ngayon ang may human rights eh. I want to be clear. Pasito is not bloodthirsty. In fact, later in the conversation, he disavows the killing. He thinks we should be helping addicts, trying to save them. And over the police who kill innocent people in the name of Tokhang will be punished. But he doesn't understand why the ICC is taking the side of the people who were Tokhang. As he was saying this, I automatically interjected because I tried to explain to him, well, no, it's because they're being denied due process. Parang automatic was my reaction, no, you're misunderstanding. It's because they're being denied due process. Pero may proseso, sabi niya. He insisted. They're given a chance, the chance to surrender and to rehabilitate. Libre pa. And so he countered immediately with a different understanding of what was going on. Sabi niya, most people use that chance to change, and that's a good thing. But some people just don't want to stop because they're making money off drugs. And for these few, to him, Tokhang seems justified. I simply want to underscore this radically different interpretation from the one we, including myself, usually make. Okay, so one more slide, please. All right, okay, so let's wrap up. So this presentation is about understanding Tokhang from below, but I want to be clear, this should not be taken as justifying it. In fact, the account I've shared corroborates a picture of Tokhang as indiscriminate, ruthless, and bloody. And to be sure, this is a picture the world needs to see. But it's also a picture, I will suggest to you, with significant blind spots. So let me talk about Father Fred. So Father Fred is an NGO that helps the families of EJK victims. And this is good work, no? This is good work. When I asked him why so many poor people support the drug war, he seemed taken aback by the question, as if he hadn't considered it. After a moment, he resorted to a set of stock answers. Sabi niya, they're brainwashed by all the disinformation on social media. They lack schooling, they can't think critically. And so part of his advocacy then is to educate, that's his word, to educate the people he serves. And that means getting them to see Tokhang the right way, and generally getting them to adopt the right politics. In fact, he's proud of the fact that by the end of his program, some of the women who had originally planned to vote for BBM in the 2022 election switched sides to Leni Robredo. He encouraged them to return to their communities and campaign for her. She only lost, he insisted, because Marcos had cheated. The problem with this approach is that it assumes that we, social elites, know better than the poor about how to make sense of their own lives. We don't take their experiences and perspectives into account, and worse, insist that they adopt our own way of looking at things. This is problematic because we ourselves can't see the full picture from where we stand. And because we don't understand why the poor support Tokhang, we discount this support and we discount them. This is a way of not facing reality. The fuller picture is more complex. It's more complex. So first, with respect to support, while it's true that some people in these communities oppose Tokhang entirely, most people support it, although to be clear, not entirely. Support is complex, not uncritical. Second, with respect to local participation, while it's true that Tokhang was orchestrated from above, true. It's also true that people mobilized from below to make it work. It involved the active participation of the barangay and community members. Finally, with respect to its public evaluation, the local account of Tokhang as justice complicates the global account of Tokhang as an injustice, a crime against humanity. Now, I want to be clear again. The one account does not preclude the other. The hard thing to accept is that both accounts can be true. The difficulty lies in holding them together as different aspects of reality. A fuller picture is necessary because it helps us understand what happened, how it happened, why it happened, why society today remains so bitterly divided about what it meant. It also includes more of society in the conversation. Such inclusion is essential, not just to establishing the truth of the matter in its many faces, but to having society move forward. Salamat po sa pakikinig.
Thank you very much, Professor Marco. We apologize over to the participants on Zoom in case you're having problems with the audio. But yes, very much. We are now open for questions. If you have questions, kindly raise your hand here and state your name and organization. Over at Zoom, either you type in your comments on the comment section or raise your hand. Yes, sir.
I'm Chuck Crisanto, the Executive Director of the Human Rights Violations Victims Memorial Commission. I would like to thank Professor Marco for a very good presentation. It's something that we need to hear. I'd like to focus on one item, although I do have a lot of questions, but only on this one item. When you talked about moral density, a year after the drug war was reaching its peak, Chair Chito Gascon, formerly the chairman of the Commission on Human Rights, we had a meeting with 68 bishops as this was all happening. And we were explaining to them that the church should take a stand because there's a bishop in Davao who was pro-Duterte in the drug war. And I sat down with senior officials of the church at that time, and they were explaining to me the theology of common good, which I think would be something that the presentation did not touch on. The moral conscience that the church, who comprise, let's say, 85% of the Philippine population, adheres to. And in the Ten Commandments, it's clear, you should not tolerate murder. No? But this was absent, the religious dimension of it. At the end of our presentation to those 68 bishops, there was a discussion, and they asked, what should we do? The bishops were asking, should we do? And I answered, I was trained in management, I come from AIM, and if it's a managerial solution, I can have a managerial solution. But is this not an area wherein it's a conscience-building solution? It's providing that moral dimension in approving a war wherein your neighbors get killed. Although we do know that the common good theology is, as you mentioned, it's for the good of the barangay, of the community. And if they don't participate in that overall good of the community, they should be kicked out. Or worse, during the drug war, just killed off. So my question after this long introduction is, why did you not consider the moral guardians of our community, the Christians, the Methodists, even the Catholic Church, in your presentation when you talked about moral density?
Thank you, Paul, for the question. First, let me start off by saying that, I appreciate this is a controversial topic, but I understand my role very narrowly as a scholar, as an academic, as a researcher. I'm not a policymaker. I'm not a pundit. I'm not any of those things. The one thing I do is I am an ethnographer. And so that means I go into these communities, and it's my job, as I see it, to really try to understand how people in those communities make sense of the world. And in order to understand their views, I have to understand how they live. And so in my head, that's my job description. So with respect to the moral guardians, as you put it, sir, there's no shortage of moral guardians, to be sure, in urban poor communities, and the ones I've studied. whether coming from the church or whether coming from NGOs or whether coming from civil society. A lot of people claim to speak for the community and claim to know what's best for the community. I think that's part of the dynamic of civil society in the Philippines. But in my years of research, what I have noticed that there's considerable distance between the way the moral guardians see the world and the way people in the communities see this world. I'm not saying one's wrong or one's right. I'm just saying that there's distance between these two ways of understanding the world. And sometimes it's the case that people who claim to be moral guardians are speaking really out of their own experience rather than, or perhaps claiming moral good in universal terms without really making the effort to understand that what's moral for one community may actually be very different for another community. And what I've tried to show in this presentation is from the point of view of people in these communities. These are not bad people. These are not bloodthirsty people. No one wants killing. Right? In fact, they have the greatest motivation not to see people killed because these are their neighbors. These are their family members. No one wants people killed. What they do want is security so that they can get out of poverty. So sana lang makatapos, so they can prosper, so they can flourish. And they've come to believe that if the price of insecurity, now, of course, this bargain was imposed upon them with Tokhang, right? It's not something they chose. No doubt there are better approaches to providing security than Tokhang. That's certainly true. Nonetheless, this is what happened. And I'm suggesting that what I found on the ground is that people are accepting the cost for the price of security because security is essential to their discarte. And discarte is about prospering, flourishing. It's about their children, as I tried to illustrate. And so, with all due respect to the moral guardians, you have to be part of that community and really understand what it's like. And so to have people from outside say, dapat ganito ang iniisip mo, dapat ito ang binoboto. There's a gap, no? I mean, maybe some people subscribe to the NGOs and they subscribe, but when I hear them talk in private in their households, there's one woman I talked to. She was part of an NGO. She described herself as an activista, and she was part of this NGO that was anti-Duterte, but she was pro-Tokhang because nabawasan talaga yung drug problems sa community. And it was very hard for me to reconcile these two things. How can you, so it didn't necessarily follow that, you could be anti-Duterte for various reasons, but you could be pro-Tokhang because that was the common sense in a lot of these communities. Common sense, ibig sabihin, hindi lang individual versus another individual. I came to see that while there was a great deal of variation, while again, support is complex, not uncritical, people did acknowledge that their communities got safer. And I'm suggesting, part of the advocacy behind this presentation, I'm suggesting that we need to take that into account in our conversation. I don't know where the conversation will end up. I leave that to you. But this is part of reality that it feels like we're not seeing. We need to see it because it bears on the conversation at hand. And if we want to move forward, we have to take it into account. So, salamat po.
Just a short follow-up to that. Of course, that's the moral guardian default that they will try to defend their faith regarding the sanctity of human rights. In that meeting, which I just described, there were a lot of bishops who were actually supporting Duterte. And in fact, when Duterte was brought to The Hague, there's one bishop in Davao who held a mass in the cathedral, and the cathedral was packed to pray for Duterte. So even our moral guardians are split in terms of supporting or not supporting Duterte. But from their point of view is something that is worrisome. And I hope that as you do this research of yours, they are an important force as well in small communities. Especially de Iglesia ni Cristo.
Thank you, sir. Related to that, let me just read a comment from May Chanko. She's wondering if you have any study on faith-based community approach, how faith religion affects the rehabilitation of the urban poor surrenderees.
Well, I think that's an easy question to answer because the rehab programs are very much faith-based. You know, it happens with the assistance of pastors. I would refer Ma'am Chanko, is it? I would refer her to the work of Awen Briones, who writes about voluntary surrender. And she describes the process of voluntary surrender. And you can't disentangle it from kind of a pastoral outreach, no? Because because people are led to rehabilitate spiritually, as well as, you know, in terms of drugs. And so there's a Catholic component very much built into it. So these two things, it's the Philippines after all, so these two things can't really be disentangled, no?
Thank you. You, sir, and then.
Good day, Dr. Garrido. It's a very insightful talk. I'm LA from Grips in Tokyo. So, well, first, before I explain, I tell you my question, just want to say that you're my academic hero. I even brought my girlfriend with me because because you're my idol. But anyway, my question is my question is a little bit tangential to what you've discussed. So my question is more on Tokhang from the middle. I understand that, you know, you did your field work in patchwork cities, in different middle class communities. So I want to know your thoughts on what's the appreciation of the middle class and maybe in the upper class of Tokhang. So what explains the seemingly, you know, high support of Tokhang and Duterte among the middle and the upper class? So yeah.
Great question. I would refer to the survey data. No, because I want to be clear. My ethnography focused on the poor communities, but I have enough of a sense of middle class communities to begin to answer that question. If you'll notice from the SWS data, support for Tokhang among the ABC, you know, middle to upper class, was kind of volatile. In fact, you see these kind of dips, 25 points, 30 points, and then if you line it up with what's happening on the ground, you see it's really responses to scandals, whether it's Kian de los Santos or whether it's Ju or these kinds of things. To me, what that tells me is that Tokhang, for the most part, for the middle class, is abstract. In other words, they're responding to the idea of Tokhang. This is very different from the way urban poor communities, particularly in Tondo, are experiencing Tokhang. Tokhang for them is pinatay yung pinsan ko. So what do the numbers tell us? The numbers tell us that the volatility in ABC said that kung pangit ang Tokhang sa media, that will be reflected in the survey data. When you look at the urban poor data, Kian de los Santos doesn't make the numbers budge. Why? Because they're looking around their community and seeing nabawasan. So I'm suggesting that I think they're responding to different things. And the take home, I think, for me, is that Tokhang for men, I don't want to overgeneralize, but for many middle class communities is abstract. The idea of Tokhang that they like or don't like. And because it's abstract, it's fungible. You know, in other words, it's sensitive to controversy. Not so for the urban poor. A fundamental difference. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Inez from Novax Philippines. So our work is on drug policy reform, and we work closely with communities of people whose lives include drugs. And like you, Dr. Garrido, thank you so much for this talk, because I wasn't able to catch the other one. Like you, I guess like most of us, we're trying to really make sense of things that were going on. And I think that's the important work in trying to move forward. I heard from the last time na the question is, what do we do next? I think it's not parang, sige, actually mahaba yung mga questions ko. I'll try to be concise. Siguro yung first is, mahirap mag-isip ng solusyon kapag hindi pa natin na-identify kung ano talaga yung problema. Okay. There is an assumption right off the bat in any discussions around drugs and trying to figure out what to do is that drugs ang problema. Is it? Maybe drugs is just part, as you said, it's part of people's lives. So I was trying to reflect. So I'm curious also. This is one of the many questions I have, pero ito muna siguro. Because these are areas that you've been immersed in for a long time, even prior to 2016. And of course, prior to when this particular section of your research was done. So I am curious also if anything there in the conversations nag-surface about drugs and how did the residents articulate or express anything around drugs? Because it seems it did not, tama ba? It did not really figure out as prominently, right? So what were the perceived concerns then? So I'm trying to link it now, and there may be many, I have thoughts around this also, na biglang na-highlight si drugs, therefore na-highlight si Tokhang. So siguro yun muna yung question, and if there's time for the others, kasi as you said, it's complex and nuanced. And I also think in webs and nuances. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the question. The fundamental issue is security. Why? Is security. Why security? Because security allows people to build their lives and to get out of poverty. It's security. Drugs is only one part of that issue. In fact, I didn't get a chance to go into it, but if the problem is disorder, right? Gulo, disorder, it appears in many faces, and drugs is only one face. In fact, within these communities, what are the main sources of gulo? Number one, disputes between neighbor and between couples. Makes sense naman, di ba? Because disputes spill over and can destabilize beyond the household parts of the community. So number one, disputes. There are problems with mga youth rumbles. Hindi naman gangs, but there's fights over territory. And then, of course, robbery, knockout theft, and drugs is part of that. So I don't want to make it sound like drugs is the only scourge to this community. You know, I want to be, again, there are a number of issues at stake. And from the point of view of people, they want security in order to live their lives and to begin to prosper. But it's true then, you might say then it's true that the issue of Tokhang kind of drugs on the map and highlighted it. But gulo is a bigger problem than it's not just about drugs. It's about the lack of security, the lack of stability.
I think that's what's interesting for me is that they suddenly seem to have found a scapegoat by identifying drugs as the problem. And with Tokhang, the way it was done, na parang they felt like they were solving something when in fact maybe the concerns before was how inequality, poverty, walang trabaho, magulo. So is that something na suddenly they found connection?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yun po ang fundamental. Poverty and security.
Yeah, and yet now they connected all of these
Yeah.
to drugs.
Opo.
So parang yun yung question,
Yeah.
no? And then second, it made me reflect and go back to, if you remember, the PNP CMC 2016, which is something. When you look at it, people look at it about negation, neutralization, when in fact, it's a fantastic communications document because it outlined exactly how this is against the poor, kaya we have to protect them and save them. It made sure the barangay was there because as he said, the barangay is yung tinitingnan. Am I going? I guess I'm just checking if it's kind of going that direction. And so it gave it legitimacy within the community. And by people sending names, reporting, now there's sense of efficacy. Now they feel they're able to do something where before they were powerless against, feeling powerless against the bigger structural concerns. And I just wanted to add something about the barangay. Kasi ito yung fuller picture. So the dream is to have a conversation with different researchers. Because sa barangay, also knowing that because we work also with LGUs, apart from people who are using drugs and participating in engagement in the drug trade system, but that there were directives and there were sanctions if they wanted to do this. Because a Plan Tokhang and the CMC was also based on a prior Dangerous Drugs Board regulation on barangay drug clearing. And that this barangay drug clearing continues until today and is considered the flagship. So ang daming parts. Ang flagship kasi ng barangay drug clearing, tinabi namin sa Tokhang, pareho siya. Identifying, reporting, and so on. And the drug watch list, nobody gets out from the drug watch list. It's deceiving when they say na meron. Hindi yan nakakaalis. Yun lang siguro. So very, very nuanced and complex. So thank you again for
Thank you,
this. Thank you.
Any other question? Let me just read this question online from Nozomo Kitajima. These two questions are, is this study published or going to be published in a journal? Would love to read it in full. If not, if possible, to have a copy of the slides. And would you say this difference, gap, or chasm between urban poor and middle class understandings of Tokhang deepens the largely upper middle class discourse of the Bobotante?
Thank you for the very specific questions. Those are easy to answer. So the question is, no, it's not published. I was eager to present it to you, to an audience, before I dared publish it. So I wanted the feedback. I wanted to hear how it would be received. So no, it hasn't been published. And second, with respect to class divide, I think that's part of what, if you know anything from my previous research and my previous book of Patchwork City, that's really the central concern of that book. And I think here too it matters. I think you can see it here as well. There's a presumption. So let me just say that there's a presumption that people know what Tokhang is and what it meant, and they have the full story. And I am suggesting that's only part of the story. And that if we want to move forward and have a real conversation, I mean, not just for the moment, but in the long durée, as it were, if we're going to grapple with this, what happened historically, and you know, Tokhang, the way people talk about it, they talk about it the same way they talk about COVID. It was an event that had a tremendous impact in these communities. They remember where they were when it happened. They remembered what it felt like. They remember this incident or that incident, similar to COVID, the same sense of fear, the same sense of panic. If we're going to grapple with what it meant to these communities and what it means for us, we need to have all the pieces. This is just one piece. There are other pieces, no? This is just one piece, but at least from my point of view, this is a piece of the puzzle that we seem to consistently overlook or discount. That's the issue. So when we put Dantes insofar as, I suppose it's a piece with the presumption that we know better about how the urban poor make sense of their lives, instead of being curious and trying to find out. So ethnography is a means of trying to find out, trying to understand. Now, as to what it means, I leave that to the larger social conversation.
Okay, we have time for just one more question.
Si Karina. Just-
Yes, okay. Sorry, yes.
I'm Karina Bolasco. I used to be a book publisher. How does this speak to your big question about the Filipinos' concept of democracy?
Yeah.
I mean, the bigger,
Oh, no,
bigger.
it's a great question, Karina. It's also a big question. No? So let me just, let me just reflect upon it. Like I said, my project is about people's experiences of democracy on the ground. And what struck me is that so oftentimes you're familiar, seguro, with the portrayal of the Philippines as a deficient democracy or as a dysfunctional democracy. What's striking for somebody who studies urban poor communities is how robustly democratic these communities are. And by that, I mean, within these communities, there are all kinds of mechanisms of consultation. People ask, people learn from, people know, people share. The only way a barangay official gets elected, now that those officials, you might think, kagawad lang, or those elections are hotly contested. And if you ask people their motivation, you might think, again, speaking from the outside, you might think, oh, maybe they want to make money, maybe. True, or certainly more complex. They're part of that community and they want to represent it. It's meaningful. It's meaningful for them. But insofar as democracy means, being accountable to a public, there's a public and it's able to convey its demands, and you as the official are responsive to it somehow. Urban poor communities are robustly democratic in that sense. And I think that's something we need to consider because we're stuck with this stereotype of the Philippines as a deficient democracy, dysfunctional. And maybe at the national level, it's hard to come to any other conclusion, siguro. You just turn on the news. But governance is happening at multiple levels. You can't say Philippine government is just, you turn on the TV, you see the impeachment trial. It's more than that. There are thousands of communities that are being governed in ways where people feel heard and are being included in that conversation. So at least at that level, to me, I'm struck by how democratic those processes are, as opposed to, say, a middle-class subdivision where they don't even know where the barangay is or who the barangay officials are. And so they're led to think about democracy in a fundamentally different way, but that's not the way it works in these poor barangays, not at all. They know exactly who the kagawads are, who the tanods are, and they know to hold them accountable the next election. So this is I'm saying that politics works in a fundamentally different way depending on what you're looking at. And this is why understanding that the country is socially heterogeneous, that there are different spaces where things work differently, is to me essential to understanding how things really work. So,
I yeah.
may question pa.
Okay,
Sige.
one last question. Then
Sige, one last. Good afternoon. Thank you for your fantastic insights from your paper. Galing. Salamat, Kate. Okay, I'm Dennis Arroyo, an economist. And I thank you for your insight on the very meticulous accounting. Okay, yung baboy na 1/3 and all that. Yeah, incredible. Kasi kaming mga economist, we tend to shrug off inflation rates of 3% or less. Okay, it's tolerable, but hindi eh. You're showing inflation can be lethal to the urban poor, particularly. And thank you for that wake-up call. Okay.
In fact, to that point, I'm excited because you're touching upon something that really came out in my research so strongly. One of the major sources of gulo was not drugs, but inflation. It's just that there was so little they can do about it. But so remember, I was doing my research in siguro in the wake of, this is 2023, so Marcos had just taken office. And people's support for Marcos varied depending on the inflation rate.
Then second, do you have any paper regarding the impact of the COVID crackdown on the urban poor? Do you have any paper?
I
No,
don't.
wala.
No, there's some work on that I've seen, but I myself haven't written about that. I just do know it was significant. It was a real event, on par with Tokhang. I mean, they tell stories about how the community, I mean, that's another example where the barangay was central.
Oh, yeah.
to mobilizing, to distributing ayuda, to distributing vaccines. So it's funny because they talk about COVID and Tokhang sometimes in the same breath, as kind of in my life, these two events kind of shaped our community. And in both cases, the barangay was central.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you po.
Salamat po.
Thank you very much. And with that, please, let's thank Dr. Garrido for his wonderful presentation. And as usual, it's our tradition to have a group picture. So yes, please gather here at the stage for a group picture. In the meantime, for those who wish to request for a certificate of participation, just email using the invitation sent to you. Okay? And thank you very much to all our participants online. And we hope to see you again in our next Kapihan. Thank you very much.